We're gonna cover if this old school time-tested hack actually works, and we're gonna reveal what it is shortly, and we're gonna start right now. So I want everybody to think, you're walking through a bedroom. The door is slightly cracked, okay, so the door is open and it's dark. So you're walking through the bedroom, it's dark, you can't really see, and you walk and you get into the door and you think the door is shut, but it's open. And when you walk into the door, you actually stub your toe. So when you stub your toe, you start to grit your teeth and moan and just, you start to lose your mind and almost get a little bit frustrated, almost get a little bit mad, but you're, internally yelling. One of the aspects here is that we know, based off of this reaction and based off of data, that yelling and subsequently even swearing can help quite a bit with discomfort and with pain. So when you're doing something that requires a large amount of discomfort or pain, we inherently start to yell. Now, let's fast forward a little bit. Now let's think about we're in high school and your high school coach is telling you, you gotta get angry, you gotta yell a little bit, let's just try and yell a little bit. And what ends up happening is you feel like you have a little bit more power, but you don't actually know if that works. Now we can look at other sports. We look at a sport like Olympic weightlifting, or we look at sports like throwing, and we can see athletes, they might scream like crazy. Someone like Joe Kovacs is in a practice session and he might warm up without any yells at all, and then all of a sudden you hear this boop, and that ends up going a little bit further. Now we don't know if it's based off of that actual yell that we see this distance elongated, or if he's just dialing up his intensity, or a little bit of both. There is some research on whether or not yelling can actually improve things like aerobic capacity. We're gonna break down a research paper, look at what that paper actually says, what they found, and then go over how you guys can apply this to your training today to optimize your aerobic capacity. So a group of researchers released a paper named The Effect of Yelling on Maximal Aerobic Power During an Incremental Test of Cycling Performance. And so what these researchers did is they took 23 different individuals and they put them on a bike where they started to actually pedal in these specific trials with 25 watts per minute, and then they just gradually increased those watts. Now they did 2 different trials, and during these trials they tested 2 aspects. One, they weren't allowed to yell at all. Another test was that as they gradually increased their wattage per minute, they were allowed to actually yell. So they were allowed to yell 3 times during that state of overall fatigue. And then what the researchers did is they analyzed, okay, what was going on with their vastus lateralis, because that's a key muscle in regard to cycling. Second, let's look at what happens with oxygen intake. Let's look at things like heart rate and actually figure out, is yelling helping aerobic performance, specifically to cycling-based performance? Now, right off the bat, one of the interesting aspects is that peak power and the time to exhaustion were higher when the individuals were allowed to yell. So that means they put out more power, okay? They lengthened the timeline that it took for them to attain some type of exhaustion. Now, subsequently, they were testing the vastus lateralis, so they were doing EMGs on the vastus lateralis, and in both tests, yelling and non-yelling tests, the vastus lateralis power output remained the same. Okay, the EMG response was about the exact same. Now here's where it gets really interesting. During the yelling test, when these individuals got from 90 to 100% of their overall output, there was a significant time by trial interaction that was observed in oxygen consumption, CO2 production, O2 pulse, ventilation, and respiratory rate. And so that basically shows us there's something going on with consumption of oxygen when we're yelling. We're releasing a large amount of CO2, we're bringing in a large amount of oxygen after this. This is gonna help us with our overall aerobic energy production. So what their conclusion ended up being, and what we wanna do is, let's look at this conclusion and then how can we apply this in our training? That's exactly how we laid out Peak Strength. Peak Strength is our app where we designed our strength training based off of different research, based off of our own research internally, finding these different protocols that can can help you with your overall training. If you guys are a cyclist or an athlete for that matter of any type of sport, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store, the Apple iOS Store, and you can actually download Peak Strength and get 5 free workouts during a 7-day trial. And you can click on cycling or any sport, which in turn is going to lead to optimizing your overall performance. Now, let's look at this conclusion. Yelling enhances the peak O2 pulse and VO2 and maintain CO2 exclusion efficiency. And so that means that when they're actually breathing in oxygen and then excluding CO2, this actually helps maintain efficiency. And this was all done during that high intensity exercise. And then they go into it may enable maintaining muscle activation without stronger EMG signals being required. So what that means is we're actually probably gonna get more out of that muscular action, even if that muscular action is equal from the non-yelling to the yelling. And so how can we now apply this to our overall training? How can we apply this to our overall performance? So first, we've got to recognize in this specific study, they're dealing specifically with aerobic capacity. So first we have to identify they're training aerobic capacity. Second, we have to identify what type of aerobic training are they doing? Are they doing, long, slow distance, or are they doing high intensity interval work? And in this specific case, they're doing a large amount of power output. So this is much more like high intensity interval training. This is the type of training that will lead to increasing your VO2 max. This is basically equated to doing some type of sprint workout. This is where things get interesting as far as the application world. If you can think of running sprints as a football player or soccer player, or running sprints as a track athlete, what ends up happening when you see these individuals, let's say you have to do 10 100s or 6 200s, as athletes that are on the elite level start to work through that workout, they end up hitting 1 or 2 or 3 reps and they maintain where they're at. As they start to fatigue mentally, what I believe ends up happening is that they let out some type of yell or some type of grunt, one, to deal with the discomfort, because I do think there is some sense of equating this to swearing. 2, that yell actually improves their oxygen intake and their CO2 expulsion. So that's another big factor, is that if you're running wind sprints, or if you're running hill sprints, or if you're out in a track workout, you can actually look at this and say, okay, if I've got 10 of these, if I've got 10 reps of 100-meter sprints, let's get to 3 or 4 or 5 sprints. And then on my 5th sprint, I might give a nice big yell. I might rest for about 20 seconds and then sprint again. And you can do that for, let's say, the 5th test, the 8th rep, and then the 10th rep to try and really optimize and pull a lot more on that back end of the workout. So we've got to make sure that we're using it as effectively as possible, but we're not actually overkilling it either. One big thing that we see with individuals who yell, 1 in throwing or 2 in Olympic weightlifting, or just football players that yell all the time when they're squatting, is that it ends up being redundant and it doesn't actually optimize their performance. It ends up hindering them to a point because they're just gearing up to yell. So we have to look at how we can use this specifically to the action of aerobic-based training, and then 2, how can you guys actually apply that? So use that when you're doing your conditioning, use that when you're doing that high intensity interval work, use this to optimize your VO2 max. It might take 4 to 6 weeks to really start to see that increase and improve, but it's something that you can keep in your back pocket. It's a little sneaky hack that can help you improve over a long period of time. It's not gonna replace your work. You still have to get that work done. You still have to train consistently. You still have to resistance-based train, and that's gonna help improve your overall training. Again, if you guys need help with programming, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store, the Apple iOS Store, because remember, freaks, if you wanna improve your aerobic capacity, you can always let out some big time yells and cultivate your power. Peace.